January 17, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert dawn breaks cold and brittle over the ridgeline. Corporal Daniel Mackworth of the 168th Infantry Regiment crouches in a shallow fighting position, scraped from the hard pan, his hands wrapped around a rusted entrenching tool he'd found half buried near an abandoned French colonial outpost. 3 days prior, the metal is pockmarked with corrosion, the wooden handle split lengthwise and bound with strips of canvas from a torn shelter. Half around him, the American positions sprawl in disorganized clusters freshly dug, poorly camouflaged. The work of men who trained in Louisiana swamps and now found themselves thrust into North African sunlight with equipment that hadn't yet caught up to doctrine. The wind carries fine dust that coats rifle actions and works its way into ration tins. Mackworth examines the shovel in his hands, turning it over like an artifact from some forgotten war, and begins to wrap communications wire around its blade in tight, deliberate spirals. No one has told him to do this. No field manual contains instructions for what he's attempting. He works purely from instinct, from a farm boy's understanding of leverage and tension, creating something the Army Engineer Corps would later classify as improvised ordnance of expedient origin, a bureaucratic phrase that would never capture the desperate ingenuity of that cold morning, or the chain of consequences this rusted shovel would set in motion. The American experience in North Africa began with Operation Torch 3 months earlier, an amphibious gamble that put inexperienced troops onto hostile shores with inadequate training and equipment still calibrated for the previous war. The 168th Infantry Regiment, a National Guard unit from Iowa, had landed at Iran in November with men who'd never seen combat, led by officers whose tactical education came from textbooks describing trench warfare and cavalry charges. They carried M1903 Springfield rifles because there weren't enough Garrets to go around. Their anti-tank capabilities consisted of 37mm guns the troops had nicknamed door knockers for their inability to penetrate German armor. Supply chains stretched across an ocean still thick with U-boats, and what equipment did arrive often proved unsuited for desert conditions vehicles that overheated in the North African sun, rations that spoiled in the heat, radios that failed when dust infiltrated their components. The men dug in along approaches to Kasserine Pass with the grim awareness that they stood between Rommel's Afrika Korps and a potential breakthrough to Allied supply depots at Tebessa. Intelligence reports spoke of German armored formations probing American lines, testing for weakness, seeking the soft spots where green troops might break under the coordinated pressure of tanks. And veteran infantry, Mackworth had grown up on a farm outside Cedar Rapids, where improvisation meant survival fixing broken equipment with baling wire and prayer, making do with tools that should have been replaced years ago but somehow kept working, because failure meant crops lost and foreclosure. He'd enlisted in 1940, drawn by the steady pay more than patriotism, and found himself transformed from a civilian who'd never left Iowa into a soldier, tasked with holding the desert pass against the most experienced mechanized force in the world. The rusted shovel had caught his attention during a patrol along the Colonial Road, partially buried near the remnants of a French Foreign Legion staging post that had been abandoned. When France fell, something about its heft, the way the blade had corroded into irregular serrations, suggested possibility. In the lulls between German artillery barrages, he'd begun fashioning a triggering mechanism using communications wires scavenged from destroyed telephone lines, creating a tension system that would require only the slightest pressure to release. The design was simple to the point of elegance: a pressure plate fashioned from a ration tin lid, wire running to the shovel handle, and a carefully calibrated pivot point that would send the corroded blade swinging across the path of anything that disturbed the trigger. He positioned his creation on a rocky approach to narrow for tanks, but perfect for the SDKFZ 220 to scout cars the Germans used for reconnaissance. Camouflaging the wire with dust and rocks, the trigger plate nearly invisible against the desert. Floor died his platoon sergeant, a regular Army veteran named Kowalski who served in the Philippines before the war, discovered Mackworth's handiwork during a pre-dawn inspection of the perimeter. The sergeant's reaction was immediate and unambiguous: dismantle it immediately. The improvised device violated standing orders regarding booby traps, orders that existed for sound reasons rooted in international conventions and the practical concern that unmarked devices endangered friendly troops as readily as enemy forces. Kowalski pointed out that retreating American units might trigger the device, That marking it would alert the Germans, and that its very existence constituted a violation of the laws of land warfare as understood by the Army's Judge Advocate General. There were proper procedures for emplacing obstacles, approved methods involving engineers, and documented minefield records, systems that prevented friendly casualties, that maintained chains of accountability. A rusted shovel on a wire wasn't warfare, it was chaos waiting to happen. Mackworth argued weakly that the approach was clearly marked in his notebook, that he briefed his squad on its location, but Kowalski's word was final. The device was banned, ordered removed immediately, and Mackworth was relegated to filling sandbags as punishment for wasting time on cowboy nonsense, instead of improving his fighting position, according to regulation standards. But Mackworth didn't dismantle it. He told Kowalski he would, gave his word as a soldier, then simply left the device in place, covered the wire with a fresh layer of dust, and hoped the Germans wouldn't advance along that particular approach. It was a decision made from stubbornness, rather than strategy, the kind of small defiance that soldiers throughout history have employed when they believe their immediate reality contradicts the wisdom of distant authority. He told himself he'd remove it after dark, that he'd get to it once he finished reinforcing the position's frontal parapet, that he'd take care of it before it became a problem. The hours slipped past in the timeless monotony of defensive positions, watching, waiting, eating cold rations, drinking water that tasted of the jerrycan it came from. The rusted shovel remained in place, its wire invisible, its trigger set, a small violation that seemed insignificant against the larger chaos of war. The German attack began at 03:30 hours on January 19th with an artillery preparation that walked across American positions in methodical waves. Heavy shells that erupted in fountains of rock and dust, forcing men deep into their holes while fragments whined overhead. When the barrage lifted, the distinctive engine note of German armor filtered through the smoke, not the heavy rumble of panzers, but the higher-pitched whine of scout cars and half-tracks, reconnaissance elements probing for gaps in the American line. 3 SDKFZ to 120 armored cars approached along separate routes, their commanders standing in open turrets, scanning the ridgeline for anti-tank positions, radioing coordinates back to the follow-on armor. The vehicles moved with the confidence of veterans, crews who fought across Poland, France, and deep into Russia, men accustomed to facing opponents who broke under the coordinated application of German tactical doctrine. They'd read the intelligence assessments describing American troops as inexperienced and poorly led, garrison soldiers playing at war, more likely to retreat than stand. The scout car commander, who chose Mackworth's approach, did so because it offered concealment from direct fire positions on the ridge, a covered route that would allow him to close within grenade range of the American foxholes. His driver, a veteran named Klaus Richter, who earned an Iron Cross second class at Smolensk, guided the vehicle into the narrow defile with practiced ease, scanning for the telltale disturbances that indicated mines or obstacles. The trigger plate compressed under the scout car's left front tire with a sound like a distant door closing. In the fraction of a second that followed, the communications wire pulled taut, releasing the tension Mackworth had spent hours calibrating. The rusted shovel swung across the vehicle's path at precisely the angle its creator had intended, the corroded blade catching the scout car's front suspension at the junction, where the wheel connected to the steering assembly. The impact shouldn't have mattered. A rusted shovel against an armored vehicle, agricultural implement versus military engineering, but the blade's irregular serrations, the product of years of corrosion, caught in the suspension's mechanical components with the grip of interlocking gears. The scout car's momentum became its enemy. 3 tons of German armor trying to move forward while the shovel's handle, wedged against a rock formation, refused to yield. Something in the steering mechanism sheared with a metallic crack audible. Even over the engine noise, the vehicle lurched violently to the left, its damaged wheel locked at an impossible angle, and the driver's instinctive correction sent the scout car into a rolling skid that ended when it impacted the defile's rock, while at 40 kilometers per hour. The collision crushed the driver's compartment, killing Richter instantly. The commander, thrown from the open turret, struck his head against an outcropping and lay motionless in the dust. The vehicle's radio operator crawled from the wreckage, with a compound fracture of his left leg, screaming in German for a medic, the sound carrying across the battlefield with terrible clarity. American troops in nearby positions, men who'd been bracing for an armored assault, stared at the destroyed scout car in confusion and dawning wonder. a rusted shovel, a strand of communications wire, and the basic physics of leverage and momentum had achieved what their 37mm anti-tank guns might have failed to accomplish. The wreckage burned slowly, producing thick black smoke that marked the approach as impassable to subsequent German vehicles. The attack's momentum faltered as follow-on elements, observing their destroyed scout car, reported a previously undetected minefield and called for engineers to clear a path. The delay, measured in minutes that stretched into hours, allowed American forces to reposition anti-tank assets and coordinate artillery fire. That turned the narrow approaches into killing zones. Sergeant Kowalski reached Mackworth's position 2 hours after the scout car's destruction, his face reflecting emotions that cycled between fury at the disobeyed order and reluctant admiration for its result. He said nothing at first, simply stared at the burning vehicle, then at Mackworth, then back at the wreckage. The words, when they came, were quiet. "You just made my life very complicated, son." Because now there were questions from the company commander, who wanted to know how a rusted shovel had destroyed a German scout car, from the battalion intelligence officer, who needed to document the engagement, for after-action reports, from the regimental commander, who saw either a dangerous precedent or innovative tactic depending on how it was framed. Mackworth had violated a direct order, risked friendly casualties through an unapproved improvised device, and achieved a tactical success that would ripple through the chain of command, with consequences no one could yet predict. The German soldiers, who'd expected to face poorly trained Americans armed with inadequate weapons, instead encountered something their doctrine hadn't prepared them for: the improvisational creativity of men who treated warfare not as a science perfected through training, but as a problem to be solved with whatever tools came to hand. The destroyed scout car became a puzzle that demanded explanation. German intelligence officers, examining the wreckage after American forces withdrew from Kasserine following subsequent German breakthroughs, tried to categorize what they found. The after-action reports filed by survivors described an anti-tank mine of unknown type, possibly a new American design incorporating some form of articulated striking mechanism. The rusted shovel, still wedged in the destroyed suspension, was photographed and analyzed. Engineers attempted to reconstruct how it had functioned, creating technical diagrams that tried to impose order on what had been pure improvisation. The reports noted with puzzlement that the device appeared to have been constructed from agricultural equipment and communications wire components. That suggested either sophisticated camouflage of a new weapons system or a disturbing level of field improvisation that indicated American soldiers were adapting to combat conditions with unexpected speed. What the German analysts couldn't fully comprehend was the culture that had produced Mackworth's rusted shovel, a society where scarcity and abundance existed in paradoxical proximity, where men grew up fixing broken machinery because replacement parts cost money farms didn't have, where the boundary between civilian ingenuity and military application blurred in ways European armies, with their traditions of specialized technical corps and rigid doctrinal hierarchies, struggled to replicate. The American military of 1943 was still forming its identity, still determining what kind of army it would become. It had inherited European military traditions through its officer corps, many of whom had trained with French and British advisors, studying tactics that emphasized preparation, coordination, and adherence to established procedure. But it was staffed with men like Mackworth farm boys and factory workers, mechanics and tradesmen, citizens who'd worn uniforms for months rather than years and who brought to warfare the same pragmatic creativity they'd applied to civilian problems. The tension between these traditions would define American military effectiveness throughout the war. The struggle between doing things the proper way and doing whatever worked, between following doctrine and adapting to reality. Army Engineer Corps officers, arriving at the sector 3 days after the engagement to document the improvised device for potential replication, faced the same dilemma that had paralyzed Sergeant Kowalski. The rusted shovel mechanism was undeniably effective. It had destroyed an enemy vehicle using materials that cost nothing and could be assembled by an individual soldier in under an hour. But it was also undeniably dangerous. It couldn't be cleared safely without detailed knowledge of its trigger mechanism. It endangered anyone who approached the area, friendly or enemy. It couldn't be mass-produced or standardized, because its effectiveness depended on specific terrain features and the individual soldier's improvised engineering. Most fundamentally, It represented a philosophy of warfare that contradicted the increasingly sophisticated approach to combat that modern armies required, an approach based on coordination, combined arms, and standardized equipment that allowed forces to operate with predictable effectiveness across diverse conditions. The official report filed by Major Thomas Hendrickson of the Corps of Engineers attempted to navigate these contradictions. It documented the device's construction and function with technical precision, noting measurements, materials, and mechanical principles. It acknowledged the tactical success achieved at minimal cost. Then it recommended against field replication, citing safety concerns, international law considerations, and the unpredictable nature of improvised ordnance. The report's conclusion proposed a middle path: incorporate the underlying principles into official Army doctrine regarding expedient anti-vehicle obstacles, but do so through engineered solutions that could be safely employed, properly marked, and reliably cleared. The rusted shovel would be studied, its lessons absorbed, but not copied. The innovation would be domesticated, channeled through proper procedures, made safe and predictable, and thereby robbed of the very spontaneity that had made it effective. But word spread through the ranks faster than official reports traveled. Up the chain of command, soldiers heard the story of Mackworth's banned device and its unlikely success. They heard it in versions that grew with each retelling. The rusted shovel became a carefully engineered mechanism. The scout car became a Panzer IV. Mackworth became a hero who'd single-handedly stopped a German breakthrough. The truth mattered less than the story's symbolic weight. Here was proof that American soldiers could improvise solutions to problems that doctrine hadn't anticipated, that the war could be won through creativity as much as firepower, that a Iowa farm boy with a rusted shovel could defeat German military engineering. The story spread to other units, carried by men rotating through field hospitals, passed along supply lines, mentioned in letters home that made it past censors. It became one of the war's minor legends, the kind of story that never appeared in official histories, but lived in the collective memory of the men who served. For the German forces, who continued to face American units throughout the North African campaign, the destroyed scout car represented something more troubling than a tactical setback. It suggested that American forces were adapting, learning, becoming more dangerous with each engagement. The intelligence assessments that had dismissed American troops as poorly trained garrison soldiers required revision. Reports began noting increased evidence of field improvisation, modified weapons, non-standard tactics, unexpected defensive measures that didn't appear in captured American field manuals. German commanders, veterans of campaigns where their tactical and technological superiority had carried them to victory after victory, found themselves facing an opponent whose very inexperience became a kind of advantage. American units didn't know what was impossible, so they attempted things that properly trained European soldiers would have rejected as impractical. Sometimes these attempts failed spectacularly, but sometimes, often enough to matter, they succeeded in ways that disrupted German planning and forced adaptation to unexpected threats. The rusted shovel acquired a second life in the bureaucratic struggles that defined the American military's internal development. Officers advocating for increased autonomy for frontline troops pointed to Mackworth's success as evidence that soldiers possessed tactical creativity that shouldn't be constrained by rigid adherence to procedure. Officers emphasizing standardization and doctrinal purity cited the same incident as proof that improvisation, however occasionally successful, created more problems than it solved. The debate played out in staff colleges and training centers, in field manuals being drafted and revised, in 1,000 small decisions that shaped how the American military would fight. It was part of a larger conversation about what kind of army America would build, one that emphasized individual initiative or collective discipline, one that prized innovation or reliability, one that treated soldiers as interchangeable parts in a machine or as individual problem solvers granted autonomy to act on their judgment. Corporal Mackworth himself received a contradictory set of consequences. He was officially reprimanded for disobeying Sergeant Kowalski's direct order to dismantle the device, a reprimand that went into his service record and technically disqualified him from promotion. Simultaneously, he was unofficially commended by his company commander, who made sure the incident appeared in after-action reports in terms that emphasized tactical success rather than procedural violation. He was called to demonstrate his trigger mechanism to engineer officers, then told never to construct another one. He became simultaneously an example to emulate and a cautionary tale about the dangers of unauthorized innovation. His fellow soldiers treated him with the careful respect reserved for men who'd achieved something noteworthy, but dangerous, the kind of reputation that was equal parts admiration and concern. He'd proven something about American ingenuity, but also something about the chaos that ingenuity could unleash when divorced from coordination and control. The symbolic weight of the rusted shovel extended beyond its immediate tactical impact. It became, in the mythology that American soldiers constructed around their own experience, a representation of their relationship to material abundance and scarcity. American forces would eventually be remembered for the overwhelming industrial capacity they brought to the war, the endless streams of vehicles and weapons, the supply depots stocked with goods that seemed miraculous to British and Soviet allies, the casual abundance that allowed American units to operate with logistical margins that would have been impossible for any other military. But in North Africa in early 1943, that abundance was more promise than reality. The Liberty ships were still building the supply bridge across the Atlantic. The factories were still ramping up production. The men in foxholes outside Kasserine had what they carried with them and what could be scrounged from local sources. The rusted shovel represented that interim moment when American soldiers had to make do with improvised solutions, when they couldn't yet rely on industrial superiority to compensate for tactical inexperience, when they had to be clever and resourceful because they couldn't yet be overwhelming. As the war progressed and American industrial capacity finally reached the front lines, the need for improvised devices like Mackworths diminished. Soldiers received proper anti-tank mines, carefully engineered devices that came with safety mechanisms and clearing procedures. They received bazookas that could penetrate German armor. They received the equipment that doctrine assumed they possessed. The rusted shovel became unnecessary, a relic of the learning period when the American military was still discovering what it would become, but the memory persisted, carried forward by the men who'd served in North Africa, passed on to replacements, incorporated into the informal knowledge that complemented official training. The lesson wasn't that soldiers should construct improvised booby traps. The lesson was that they possessed the creativity to solve problems that training hadn't anticipated, that American pragmatism could be a force multiplier when properly channeled. The Germans, who'd expected to face an opponent paralyzed by doctrinal rigidity, instead encountered an army that was still writing its own doctrine, still determining its character through trial and error. This flexibility would prove both a weakness and a strength. It meant American forces made mistakes that more experienced armies might have avoided. It also meant they adapted to new conditions with a speed that surprised opponents who expected rigid adherence to established patterns. The rusted shovel was a small example of a larger truth, that American military effectiveness would ultimately derive not from superior training or better individual soldiers, but from a cultural tendency toward improvisation and adaptation, a willingness to try unconventional solutions when conventional approaches failed, and an industrial base that could afford the waste inherent in experimental learning. In the decades following the war, military historians would debate the significance of improvised devices in the American tactical repertoire. Some emphasize the rusted shovel and devices like it as examples of beneficial innovation, evidence of a uniquely American military culture that valued individual initiative. Others dismiss such stories as romantic mythology, arguing that modern warfare required standardization and procedure, that improvisation was the mark of inadequate preparation rather than creative genius. The truth, as always, existed somewhere between extremes. The improvised devices mattered not because they changed the war's outcome. No single rusted shovel could do that, but because they reflected and reinforced the cultural identity that American soldiers were constructing around their own experience. They were defining themselves against multiple reference points, against the German army, with its tactical excellence and technological sophistication, against the British Army, with its long military traditions and rigid class structure, against preconceived notions of what American soldiers could accomplish. The stories they told themselves about rusted shovels and improvised solutions became part of how they understood their own effectiveness and their relationship to the larger war effort. The rusted shovel also represented a connection to American military traditions that reached back beyond the World War and Civil War to the frontier conflicts and Revolutionary War, a tradition of irregular warfare and improvised tactics, of men who fought without formal military training but possessed practical skills that translated surprisingly well to combat. Daniel Mackworth wouldn't have articulated it in these terms, but when he wrapped communications wire around a corroded entrenching tool, he was participating in a tradition that included frontier riflemen sniping at British regulars from behind stone walls, Confederate cavalry raiders destroying Union supply lines with captured equipment, and 1,000 other small acts of military improvisation that characterized American warfare. When formal forces proved inadequate, this tradition existed in tension with America's parallel military history of professional excellence and technological innovation. But both were authentic aspects of American military culture. Both contributed to the Army's eventual effectiveness. For the German military analysts trying to understand what they faced, American improvisation represented a frustrating departure from the patterns they learned to recognize. German tactical doctrine was sophisticated and flexible, capable of adapting to diverse conditions, but it assumed opponents who operated within similar doctrinal frameworks, who organized their forces in recognizable ways, who employed weapons according to their intended purposes, who could be predicted and countered through reference to established military science. American forces increasingly defied these assumptions. They used equipment in non-standard configurations. They employed tactics that seemed to ignore proper procedure. They achieved successes through methods that violated the principles their own field manuals advocated. This made them simultaneously easier to defeat in any single engagement because they made amateur mistakes that professionals could exploit and harder to defeat strategically. Because their capacity for adaptation and their willingness to experiment meant they learned quickly and didn't repeat mistakes. The afternoon sun beat down on the wreckage of the scout car, metal still hot from the morning's fire, and Corporal Mackworth sat in his fighting position cleaning his rifle, with movements made automatic by repetition. He'd been questioned 3 times about the device, had explained its construction to 2 different engineer officers, had endured Sergeant Kowalski's creative profanity describing the administrative headaches the incident had created. He'd learned that following orders was more complicated than he'd assumed, that success didn't always excuse violation of procedure, that the Army valued reliability more than innovation even when innovation succeeded. But he'd also learned that sometimes doctrine was wrong, that individual soldiers possessed knowledge the chain of command lacked, that a rusted shovel in the right place at the right time could matter more than all the proper equipment that hadn't yet arrived from the supply depots. These were contradictory lessons, impossible to reconcile into simple rules, and they reflected the contradictory nature of the Army. He served in an institution trying to balance tradition and innovation, procedure and adaptation, collective discipline and individual initiative. The story of the rusted shovel spread through the ranks with the kind of velocity that official communications could never match, carried by the informal networks through which soldiers shared information that mattered to their immediate survival. In foxholes and field hospitals, during lulls in combat and long truck rides to rear areas, men told each other about the farm boy from Iowa who destroyed a German scout car. With scrap metal and stubbornness, the details changed with each retelling, but the core meaning remained constant. American soldiers could adapt, could innovate, could solve problems that doctrine hadn't anticipated. They needed to believe this because their experience contradicted so much of what they'd been told. They'd been trained in camps that bore no resemblance to actual battlefields. They'd been equipped with weapons that sometimes failed when needed most. They'd been led by officers learning their profession in real time, making mistakes that cost lives. The official narrative promised them that American industrial might and moral righteousness would ensure victory. The unofficial narrative, the stories they told each other, offered something more immediate and personal: the promise that individual cleverness and pragmatic creativity could help them survive long enough to see that eventual victory. And somewhere in the German headquarters analyzing the day's engagements, intelligence officers filed reports about the destroyed scout car, added it to the growing file of American tactical adaptations, and revised their threat assessments upward by small increments. They noted the improvised nature of the device, speculated about whether it represented official American doctrine or individual initiative, and recommended increased caution when approaching American positions. Through restricted terrain, they were professional soldiers trying to understand a new kind of opponent, trying to fit American forces into analytical frameworks that had successfully predicted British, Soviet, and French behavior, but American forces kept refusing to fit the patterns. They were too inexperienced to be predictable, too creative to be easily categorized. the willing to experiment to be countered through reference to established tactical wisdom. This made them dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with their combat effectiveness in any single engagement and everything to do with their capacity for improvement over time. The rusted shovel remained in place for 3 days after the scout car's destruction, wires still stretched across the approach, trigger mechanism intact. Finally, Sergeant Kowalski ordered it removed and destroyed, citing the dangers it posed to American patrols and the likelihood that German forces, having identified the device's location, might attempt to clear or replicate it. Mackworth disassembled his creation methodically, unwinding the communications wire, freeing the shovel from its firing position, examining the blade that had caught in the scout car's suspension. With enough force to shear steel, the corrosion patterns had created serrations that no deliberate design could have replicated, random irregularities that happened to be perfectly suited to catching in mechanical components. It was accidental engineering, improvisation that succeeded partly through planning and partly through luck, and there was no way to standardize or replicate something that depended on the unique characteristics of one corroded tool. He carried the shovel back to his fighting position, unsure whether he'd be ordered to turn it over to the engineer officers or allowed to keep it as a souvenir. In the end, no one seemed to want responsibility for the device that had caused such administrative complications. It remained with Mackworth through the rest of the North African campaign, through the invasion of Sicily, through the Italian mainland, a rusted tool that had briefly been a weapon and now was simply a battered piece of equipment that reminded its owner of the day procedure had collided with necessity and necessity had won. He used it to dig fighting positions across 3 countries, used it until the handle finally split completely and had to be replaced, until the blade wore down to uselessness, and he replaced it with a proper Army-issue entrenching tool that was lighter and more efficient and utterly lacking in history. By 1945, when victory in Europe came and soldiers began the long process of returning home, the story of the rusted shovel had been absorbed into the larger mythology of American military effectiveness. It was one story among thousands, a minor incident, in a war defined by massive battles and strategic campaigns. But it endured because it represented something soldiers needed to believe about themselves, that they'd won not just through material superiority, but through creativity and adaptability, through the ability to solve problems that doctrine hadn't anticipated. The rusted shovel became a symbol of American pragmatism in the same way that the endless supply convoys symbolized American abundance, both essential aspects of how American forces understood their own contribution to victory. The German soldiers, who expected to face poorly armed, inadequately trained opponents, had been correct in their initial assessments. American forces in early 1943 were poorly armed and inadequately trained, but the Germans had failed to anticipate how quickly those forces would adapt, how effectively they would learn from mistakes, how creatively they would compensate for their deficiencies. The rusted shovel was a small example of a larger truth, that American military effectiveness derived not from starting with the best training or equipment, but from possessing the cultural capacity to improve rapidly, to experiment constantly, to try new approaches when old ones failed. This capacity for adaptation would prove more valuable than tactical excellence, because tactical excellence could be learned through experience, but cultural adaptability was intrinsic, a product of a society that valued innovation and pragmatism over tradition and procedure. In the final accounting, Corporal Daniel Mackworth's band device didn't change the war's outcome. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was an American defeat, a harsh lesson in what happened when inexperienced troops faced veterans. The rusted shovel destroyed one scout car in an engagement where dozens of American vehicles were destroyed by German forces. It delayed a German advance by hours in a battle measured in days, but it mattered anyway, because wars are won through the accumulated weight of 10,000 small actions, because the same creativity that produced one rusted shovel produced thousands of other improvisations, because the culture that allowed a farm boy to ignore orders and trust his own judgment was the same culture that would eventually overwhelm German forces. Through sheer adaptive capacity backed by industrial might, the shovel sits now in the basement of the Iowa National Guard Museum in Cedar Rapids, donated by Mackworth's family after his death in 1987, displayed without dramatic fanfare in a case that includes his other service memorabilia unique, patches, campaign ribbons, a faded photograph of him standing beside a destroyed German vehicle, That might or might not be the scout car his device destroyed. The museum label describes it accurately, but without poetry. Entrenching tool modified for use as improvised anti-vehicle device, Tunisia 1943. Visitors passed by with little attention, drawn instead to the more dramatic exhibits captured German weapons, propaganda posters, accounts of major battles. The rusted shovel is simply another artifact, interesting primarily to military historians and the few remaining veterans who remember North Africa and the desperate improvisations that characterized that learning period before American forces found their rhythm. But on that cold January morning in 1943, before the bureaucrats and historians could domesticate it into official reports and museum displays, the rusted shovel was something simpler and more important, proof that a single soldier could that individual creativity could affect outcomes, that American forces possessed resources beyond what appeared in equipment tables and order of battle assessments. It was proof that the German analysts who dismissed American fighting capacity had missed something essential, had failed to account for a cultural tendency toward improvisation that would manifest in 10,000 different ways across 100 battlefields. The soldier who expected to be steamrolled by superior German training and equipment instead learned that he possessed tools the Germans lacked, not better weapons or tactics, but a freedom to experiment, to fail, to try again, to solve problems through ingenuity rather than procedure, asterisk. And in the end, that freedom proved to be its own kind of weapon, impossible to standardize or replicate, impossible to counter through tactical excellence or technological superiority, a force multiplier that emerged from the intersection of American culture and the desperate necessities of modern warfare. The rusted shovel was banned because it violated procedure, destroyed a scout car because its creator ignored orders, and became a symbol because soldiers needed to believe that individual actions mattered in a war fought by millions. All of these things were simultaneously true, contradictory, and complementary, reflecting the complex reality of how democracies fight wars imperfectly, chaotically, wastefully, but ultimately with an adaptive capacity that authoritarian excellence could never quite match. The shovel endured because it represented that truth in physical form, a rusted implement that briefly became something more, then returned to being simply a tool, having changed nothing and everything in the process, asterisk.